A quiet kind of worth. In a world obsessed with surface, it's easy to forget the quiet strength of those who live without applause. Dinah's story reminds us that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy, and that sometimes the most profound kind of love comes not in youth, but after we've weathered life's hard seasons. Many of us know what it feels like to give our best only to be left behind, to be told we're too plain, too quiet, too much work, or simply too late. But Dinah teaches us something vital: worth is not measured by approval. It's revealed when someone sees you fully and chooses to stay. Her journey is a tribute to every woman who's been told she's not enough by a hurried world. It's for every person who's built a life with strong hands and a tired heart and still dares to hope that somewhere, someone will see the beauty in what others dismiss. If this story touched something in you, we invite you to be part of a community that honors the stories time nearly forgot. Subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, where the quiet, the overlooked, and the brave find their voice. Share this video with someone who needs to remember they matter. And tell us in the comments, have you ever felt unseen? Your story, like Dinah's, might just help someone else find the courage to keep going. Most people pass by Dinah Holloway without ever knowing her name. In the mining town of Clay Rock, Wyoming, 1883, she was simply the girl with the soot, the one with her sleeves rolled up elbows deep in coal dust, mending carts and stoking fires. They never asked where she came from, and she never offered. At 35, Dinah had long learned how to make herself useful without being seen. She was a labor girl, the kind who could silence a room without saying a word, not out of grace, but out of grime. Folks respected her work ethic, even relied on it. But that respect never reached as far as belonging. She lived in the attic above Miss Mabel's boarding house. A narrow bed, one window, no lace, no dreams, just the rhythm of waking before sunrise and scraping out a living before others opened their eyes. Her hands were blistered, her back sore, her heart silent. But silence doesn't mean peace, and dignity doesn't mean joy. The mail-order bride ad had been her secret prayer, not for escape, but for worth. She had written, honestly, I am strong. I work with tools. I do not have soft hands. I do not speak much, but I listen well. She signed her name in shaky script, afraid even the ink would judge her. Weeks later, a letter arrived. The man was from Wind River. A widower named Thomas Fenn. Said he admired women who worked hard. Said he liked quiet. She dared to hope. When she stepped off the train, dressed in the only clean dress she owned, hair-braided boots polished, Thomas took one look at her hands and frowned. You didn't say you worked the mines, he said stiffly. I did, she answered, voice small. I was expecting someone less rough. The next morning, without ceremony, he told her he couldn't marry a woman who looked like she'd spent her life doing a man's work. Folks'll talk, he said, as if her body was shame. He offered to pay for her train ride back. She refused. Dinah returned not to Clay Rock, but to nowhere. She wandered to a place called Haven Hollow, nothing more than a quiet patch of Wyoming prairie with a mercantile, a chapel, and a silence that didn't try to name her. There she found a bench beneath an aspen tree, and she sat, letting the wind whisper what no man had. She didn't know it then, but someone saw her. A man named Ezra Cobb, who had never spoken more than a few words to anyone, but who watched with quiet reverence. A rancher whose silence was not shame, but shelter. And the story, the real one, was just beginning. She had been turned away by men who feared her hands until one man saw the strength in them as sacred. Ezra Cobb wasn't known for his words. They said he once ran an entire cattle drive across 3 states and only spoke a full sentence to ask where the horses had gone. A big man, quiet-eyed, with hands like well-worn leather, and a presence that made rooms fall silent. He wasn't cold, just careful. Widowed young, he had carved out a life on the edge of the Wyoming range-building fences, and trust at the same speed, slow and steady. He lived alone now, except for his dog, his horse, and a quiet ache that settled deep in his chest every time he watched the sunset without someone to share it with. It was a Wednesday when he first saw her again. Ezra had been delivering feed to the chapel's outbuilding where the preacher let women do laundry and boil soap for income. He spotted Dinah kneeling by a basin, her hands red and raw, sleeves, rolled up hair pinned simply beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She didn't look up. She didn't notice him. But he noticed her. Not for her beauty, though. There was something softly arresting about her stillness. Not for her work, though she moved with precision, but for the sorrow around her, how it clung like steam to a kettle whistling quietly but never boiling over. He left the feed, said nothing. 3 days later, they crossed paths again, this time at the well. She was struggling with the pump. He stepped in silent and with one firm pull drew water from the earth. He didn't speak, just nodded, then turned to leave. She called after him, not with words but with eyes that held the weight of someone not used to being helped. Her thank you lived in her gaze. He tipped his hat in return. And something passed between them, wordless deep. The preacher's wife, who watched everything from her parlor, later remarked, "That's a man who listens without needing noise. And that girl, she's been waiting her whole life for someone who doesn't need her to explain." Over the weeks, Dinah kept finding him in the corner of her world. A boot step at the well, a shadow near the haystack, a quiet presence on the church pew behind her. He never imposed, never lingered too long, but always seemed to show up when silence threatened to crush her. One evening, she stayed late at the chapel, scrubbing candle wax from the altar floor. She didn't notice the storm rolling in. When she finally stepped out, the clouds had broken and the sky was crying hard. Her shawl was too thin. She ran anyway until a horse trotted beside her and a broad hand reached down. Ezra. He didn't speak, just dismounted, offered her his coat, and walked beside her the whole way back to the parsonage. And for the first time in years, Dinah whispered into the wind, "Why are you being kind to me?" Ezra turned, brow furrowed, not in confusion but in sorrow. "Because I see you." 3 words, that was all. But for a woman like Dinah, who had lived a life of being passed over, it was enough to rattle the walls of everything she thought she believed about her own worth. Mail-order bride, rejected for being a labor girl, until a quiet rancher saw her. Worth Dinah Holloway had survived years of noise of men telling her what she wasn't, of women whispering about who she would never be. But nothing was louder than the quiet that Ezra Cobb left behind each time he walked away. After he said, "Because I see you," she could barely sleep that night. She lay still on her narrow cot in the corner of the parsonage laundry quarters, staring up at the wooden beams. The question turned over in her mind like river stones. What did he see? Ezra never said more than he had to. He didn't bring flowers, didn't ask questions, didn't touch her. But each time their paths crossed, something wordless passed between them, a steady gaze, a nod, an act of unspoken care. She tried to tell herself it meant nothing. She wasn't young. She wasn't graceful. Her hands bore more calluses than softness. And yet, every time she felt his presence nearby, something stirred in her, a trembling of hope that she didn't trust. One morning, the preacher's wife found her sitting outside with the laundry half done, her eyes rimmed with tears. "You all right, Dinah?" "I don't know what I am," she said. "I've always worked, always survived, but now I feel like there might be something more. And I don't know if I can survive hoping for it." The preacher's wife took her hand gently. "You don't have to stop being strong to want to be loved. Those things don't cancel each other." But Dinah wasn't convinced. Her memories clawed back of that day on the platform when Thomas had rejected her. The sting of judgment in his voice. The humiliation of being sent away. What if Ezra was just being kind? What if his silence was only politeness? One afternoon, she overheard 2 townswomen talking near the well. "He's always been odd," that Ezra once said, silent as stone. "Maybe he likes quiet girls," the other laughed, casting a glance toward Dinah's direction. "Too bad she looks like she belongs in the stables." Dinah didn't flinch, but the words clanged in her like a bell, ugly and familiar. That was how the world had always spoken of her, not as a woman, but as a workhorse. That night she avoided Ezra at the chapel, didn't meet his eyes, took a different path home. The next morning, a basket sat outside her door, fresh bread, mended gloves, and a single slip of paper. Written in rough, deliberate letters. "You deserve kindness. That doesn't mean you owe anyone softness." No name, no flourish, just truth. Dinah stared at the note for a long time. She realized then that what scared her most wasn't rejection. It was the chance that someone might actually mean it. That someone might look at her hands and see not shame, but story. But even as that thought bloomed, fear clung tightly. She couldn't shake the doubt. Was she worth being chosen? Not pitied, not tolerated, but loved truly. Ezra had not yet asked anything of her. And maybe that was what frightened her the most, that his silence gave her room to believe. She had been taught to shrink herself, but now someone's quiet faith was forcing her to look inward and ask, "What if I am not the burden?" The first time Dinah invited Ezra to sit beside her, it was in the fading light of Sunday evening. She was mending altar linens behind the chapel, her needle slipping through the fabric like memory through thought. He approached slow as always with a sack of winter apples and no words. She patted the ground beside her. He hesitated only a second, then sat. They didn't speak for a long while, only the gentle rhythm of her stitching and the soft wind between them filled the space. And then, as if unspooled by silence itself, Dinah said, "Do you ever feel like your whole life has been spent proving you deserve to be in the room?" Ezra looked down at his hands, then nodded. "I was told once I was too much woman for a man to hold," she continued. "Not in size, but in work and mind and will. They said I didn't leave enough space for softness." Ezra was quiet for a long time before speaking. "My wife, before she passed, used to say I loved like a canyon. Quiet, still, deep." Dinah blinked. The moonlight caught her lashes like dew. "She said that scared people. Made 'em think I didn't care. But it just meant I carried it where no one could see." Something in Dinah's chest cracked open, a quiet release, like the earth sighing after rain. "I think I've only ever known love as something you had to earn," she whispered. "By being quieter, cleaner, thinner, smaller. I kept folding myself smaller until there was hardly anything left." Ezra turned to her, then his voice low but weighted. "You don't have to fold for me." Her breath caught. "You're already whole." It wasn't a declaration, not yet, but it was a torch held out in the dark, an invitation, not a demand. Later that week, Dinah stood before the chapel mirror, trying to remember the last time she had looked at herself without judgment. Her dress was plain, her arms strong, her waist round, but her face, soft, worn, kind, held the truth of a woman who had survived everything and still bent to hope. The next Sunday, Ezra arrived early to church. Sat beside her. Everyone noticed. No one said a word. But in the stillness of the sermon, Dinah felt her breath settle. She didn't shrink, didn't shift. For once, she occupied her own space fully. Afterward, he walked her home. Still no words exchanged, but his presence was enough. Not an interruption, just a steady rhythm next to her own. As they reached the parsonage gate, Dinah turned to him. "I was taught that only certain women are chosen. The pretty ones, the quiet ones, the fragile ones." Ezra didn't respond with words. Instead, he reached gently for her hand, calloused meeting calloused, and held it like something sacred. She had folded herself small for so long, but now love was asking her to stand tall, without apology. Spring broke across the land, like a held breath released. The snow receded from the hills, leaving behind tender green shoots and muddy paths. The world was becoming softer, warmer, and so too was Dinah. Word had spread, as it always does in small towns, that Ezra Cobb had begun to call on Dinah Holloway, that they were often seen walking together at dusk, that he'd fixed the parsonage gate, that she'd mended his coat, that something was changing in the quiet corners. Some whispered it wouldn't last, that a man like Ezra, reserved and solemn, could never truly open his heart. Others scoffed at the idea that Dinah, so plain, so work-worn, was worthy of being seen. But there was one thing they didn't understand. Neither of them had come seeking beauty or passion or the grand gestures written in novels. They had come to one another out of something far older, deeper, something like recognition. One afternoon, Ezra invited her to his land. It was a modest plot tucked beneath the shadow of a cottonwood ridge. Chickens wandered freely. A pair of horses grazed nearby. Everything was worn patched, tended with care. Like him. "I built it for someone," he said quietly, offering her a tin cup of coffee. She looked up. "Your wife." He shook his head. "No. I built it for the life I thought I'd have. Never found the right person to fill it, until now." Her breath stilled. He wasn't proposing. Not yet. But there was something in his voice, something that said he saw her in the home, not just at it. They walked the land together. He showed her where he wanted to plant a windbreak, where the root cellar stayed cool even in July, where the wildflowers bloomed in early May. And then near the fence line, he said something she would carry with her forever. "I don't want someone to rescue or someone to worship. I want someone to build with, someone to stand beside." It wasn't a poem, it wasn't fireworks. But for Dinah, it was the first time in her life a man had spoken of partnership, not possession. Later that week, she began packing. Not to leave, but to begin. She kept only what mattered. Letters from her late mother, her worn work boots, a pressed flower from her first walk with Ezra, and a sewing kit that had mended more than cloth. The rest she gave away. When the day came to leave the parsonage, the preacher's wife hugged her tightly and whispered, "You were never just a servant here. You were the strength in these walls." Dinah didn't cry. She simply nodded, shoulders squared. As Ezra helped her onto the wagon, she turned once, just once, to look back at the chapel. Not in mourning, but with gratitude. That place had sheltered her. But this man, this quiet, steadfast man, he was choosing her, and she was choosing him. Not because she was convenient, not because she was desperate, because at last she believed she was worthy. When a woman stops waiting to be chosen and starts believing she's worth choosing, that's when love knows its home. It didn't take long for the town to begin watching. People who had never greeted Dinah before suddenly took interest in her steps, her clothes, her company. Some women nodded politely at the mercantile, but only after a long stare. A few men smirked in the saloon, whispering under their breath that Cobb had taken in the labor girl. One even chuckled. Guess he needed a plow horse more than a wife. Ezra didn't answer, but the next day he walked beside Dinah through town, holding her hand in full view. That gesture, simple and firm, silenced more mouths than words ever could. Still, judgment lingered. One Sunday, a letter arrived. Dinah unfolded it with shaking hands. It was from Mrs. Holcomb, the matron, who had first matched her with the man who later rejected her for being too coarse. The letter was not an apology. It was a warning. A respectable woman ought to reconsider her public appearances, it read. You've been given a second chance. Do not shame yourself further by pretending you're something you are not. Dinah folded the letter, quietly placed it in the stove, watched it burn to ash. But that night, as she prepared dinner, her hands trembled. Ezra noticed. He didn't speak, but he took over, stirring the pot without asking. Later, seated on the porch, Dinah finally said, Do you ever feel like the more you try to live with grace, the more the world tries to shove you back where you came from? Ezra's voice was low. Yes, but it means you're rising. She looked at him then. Am I? He nodded once. You're not hiding who you are, and that terrifies people who've only ever known you in pieces. Silence fell again, but this time it was rich, grounded. That week, Dinah was invited to help lead a sewing circle for young girls at the church, something she'd never been asked to do before. There was hesitation in the preacher's eyes when he extended the invitation, but Dinah accepted with her head high. The girls adored her, not because she spoke grand words, but because she listened, because her hands were strong and sure, because she told them the truth. You're allowed to take up space in the world. One of them, a girl with thin arms and a too large apron, whispered, I didn't think someone like you could be loved. Dinah smiled gently. Someone like me, she repeated. That's the only kind that should be. At home that evening, Ezra surprised her with something. He'd carved a small wooden figure of a woman holding a lantern standing firm in the wind. She reminded me of you, he said, awkward but earnest. Dinah touched it like it was made of glass. You see me, she whispered. I always have, he replied. The world may try to erase a woman's worth, but when she holds her ground, she becomes a light no one can dim. The seasons turned. The wind softened. The sky held longer light. And somewhere between planting and harvest, between sorrow and stillness, Dinah Holloway became someone whole. She didn't change into someone else. She didn't become prettier or softer or what others once called wife material. But something had shifted in her step, in the way she looked people in the eye, in the way she held herself at Ezra Cobb's side, not behind, not beneath, not beside out of obligation, but equal, strong, and loved. There was no grand wedding in the church. Dinah had once dreamed of that ribbons-lace music, but now when the time came, she and Ezra stood beneath the cottonwood where they first talked of windbreaks and futures. With only the preacher, a few neighbors, and a handful of curious birds as witnesses, they spoke quiet vows. Ezra promised steadiness, honesty, and warmth. Dinah promised presence, grace, and the courage to stay. When asked if she took this man, she said simply, I already have. There were no cheers, no throwing of rice, just a long silence. And then from the edge of the grove, a child's voice said, She looks like a real lady. And perhaps for the first time, Dinah believed she did. But more than that, she felt like someone who belonged. Not because she'd been permitted to, but because she had claimed it. Back at their small ranch house, Ezra led her to a room she hadn't seen yet. Inside against the wall was a workbench, her size, her tools, her space. I thought you might want to keep making things, he said. Her throat caught. It wasn't a gift, it was a recognition. That she didn't stop being herself to become his wife. She became more herself. That night they sat by the fire. She mended a torn apron. He carved in silence. And in that room filled with the soft sounds of life being lived, they didn't need to speak the words. They had already said everything that mattered. Some love stories don't begin with a kiss, but with a quiet place to be exactly who you are. A quiet kind of worth. In a world obsessed with surface, it's easy to forget the quiet strength of those who live without applause. Dinah's story reminds us that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy, and that sometimes the most profound kind of love comes not in youth but after we've weathered life's hard seasons. Many of us know what it feels like to give our best only to be left behind, to be told we're too plain, too quiet, too much work, or simply too late. But Dinah teaches us something vital: worth is not measured by approval. It's revealed when someone sees you fully and chooses to stay. Her journey is a tribute to every woman who's been told she's not enough by a hurried world. It's for every person who's built a life with strong hands and a tired heart and still dares to hope that somewhere, someone will see the beauty in what others dismiss. If this story touched something in you, we invite you to be part of a community that honors the stories time nearly forgot. Subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, where the quiet, the overlooked, and the brave find their voice. Share this video with someone who needs to remember they matter. And tell us in the comments, have you ever felt unseen? Your story, like Dinah's, might just help someone else find the courage to keep going.